I've told you so far then that I think that waking and dreaming are altered states of consciousness. I've told you a little bit about why they're similar and why they're different. Now what I'd like to do is introduce a concept that is, I think, extremely alien and very hard to grasp, and that is proto-consciousness. That's a term that I made up to try to capture the notion that maybe dreaming precedes waking, maybe dreaming is more important than waking in some respects, in preparing the brain to be awake. Now, proto also means before in time, earlier than. And there's abundant evidence that it is not only that day precedes night, or night precedes the following day, but also that REM sleep occurs in the younger animal. In fact, it occurs most frequently in utero. It occurs before you're born, okay? So your brain is already self-activating when you're floating around inside your mother's stomach. And that's a really remarkable story, because what is the brain doing? It's making itself ready to be functional, to be more mature, and then finally to enable you to go to school when you get to be 3 to 5 years old. But it's a long process of development, and it's an active process. So what I'm telling you then is that dreaming, or REM sleep at least, precedes waking by several months or years. It's not just that there is a night preceding each day, it's that in terms of our development over the long course in time, dreaming is the first state that we experience, or something like dreaming, what I call proto-consciousness, because I really don't think that fetuses dream, but I do think they might experience something. And when I use the term proto-consciousness, I then move ahead and define two different kinds of consciousness. One is primary, and the other is secondary. And primary consciousness, this is a terminology that Gerald Edelman introduced, is probably the kind of consciousness that we share with all the animals. Perception, emotion, memory, whatever, all of those things are probably ubiquitous mammalian phenomena. But secondary consciousness, language, abstraction, mathematics, science, literature, are probably exclusively human. They may be a few primates that come close to this, but secondary consciousness is a uniquely human factor. And I think that primary consciousness is what we get close to when we dream. Because I don't know about you, but I can't think when I dream. I don't think well at all. I have very strong sensations and perceptions, very strong emotions, a very strong sense of agency. The dream is always about me. I'm always at the center of the dream, and I think these are important formal features that must be instantiated very early in development, even in utero, that the fetus is already a sort of self, at least by 30 weeks of gestation. And that self-agent moves in a space, just as I move in my dreams. I'm always in some space or other. It's always about me. And so my idea then is that at a very early stage in development, there is a proto-self that moves in a proto-space, okay? And it moves in the space and also feels in that space. The seeing and hearing and all the rest of the sensation is probably sort of prepared for in some way that we don't yet understand, but we can now at least begin to ask the question how that might occur. And interestingly enough, we also experience strong emotion. Now, emotion has been considered a symptom up until now. I suppose a lot of you think that anxiety is a symptom, but I say anxiety is not a symptom. Anxiety is part of the cognitive apparatus, that when you feel frightened, it's a very important feeling. And when you feel elated or happy, it's a very important feeling. When you feel angry, it's a very important feeling. And you're born with the capability of having all these emotional experiences, as well as having a sense of agency, moving in a space, and having the capacity to feel and to have emotion. So that's primary consciousness, and that's something that I think occurs in all the mammals, and all the mammals have REM sleep, okay? So again, it could be just a coincidence, but it probably isn't. It leads you to wonder, well, what is the function of REM sleep? And it turns out to be activating the brain as part of it, and I'll tell you about a couple of other parts as time goes on. But one part of it that's very surprising and completely counterintuitive is that temperature regulation depends upon REM sleep. If you take REM sleep away from an animal, and an experimental animal, he no longer can regulate his body temperature. What is body temperature doing for you? It's establishing a very narrow window for the operation of the brain. The brain does not function except in a very narrow temperature range. Think of yourself having either a fever or feeling cold, and you'll immediately appreciate how important this is. Because if you have a fever, you can't read, you can't think, you can't use secondary consciousness at all. And if you're cold, all you can do is try to get warm. So it's very important then for the organism who has a complex brain like mammals have to regulate body temperature. Now there's one other animal that regulates body temperature, and it's the only other animal that has REM sleep, and it is birds. Birds and mammals are the only animals that regulate body temperature. They are the only animals that have REM sleep. And in my view, they are probably the only animals that have something like dreaming in their experience, something like proto-consciousness. But all the other animals have primary consciousness. They just don't have secondary consciousness.